Hello, I'm Michelle Levander, Director of the U.S. Health. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our Health Matters webinar covering coronavirus, the race for a COVID-19 vaccine. In a matter of weeks, a coronavirus vaccine probably will be available. October could be the month, according to President Trump, or maybe not if you listen instead to one of the president's top scientific advisors, Anthony Fauci, MD. But whether an initial vaccine is ready this fall or in early 2021, the speed with which it has been developed and the novel technologies deployed along the way represent a game changer. Today, we'll be learning just how different this vaccine is from prior generations of vaccines, when it might be ready, and who might benefit first from it. You wouldn't be here at today's webinar if you didn't realize that there's a lot riding on the development of a successful vaccine, with the November elections around the corner, figuring prominently into questions about timing and trial protocols. The vaccine's development is one of the great scientific time. Questions and story possibilities abound, ranging from whether trials will be conducted properly without undue speed, to whether the US plan to distribute the vaccine, just released today, will be successful, to whether enough Americans will trust the new vaccine enough to take it and ensure that enough people will allow us to have what is known as herd immunity. Here to help us understand all this, we have two distinguished speakers. Umair Irfan has been covering COVID-19 full-time since the pandemic emerged. He usually covers climate change, energy, and the environment for Vox. He's also a contributor to Science Friday. Before joining Vox, Umair was a reporter for Climate Wire and E&E News in Washington, D.C., where he covered health and climate change, science, and energy policy. Dan Vergano is a science reporter for the Washington, D.C. Bureau of BuzzFeed News, where he reports on science and politics. He was previously a science reporter at USA Today and National Geographic. He's on the science writing and was a 2007-2008 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, where he focused on global warming. His educational background is in engineering and science policy. We want to thank the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation and the Commonwealth Fund for supporting this program. You can tweet about the webinar today at the hashtag #COVIDVaccine. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Because we have many people participating in this webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A panel of Zoom. You can also write us there if you're experiencing technical problems. We'll be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. And now let's get started and turn to Umair, who's going to walk us through the science behind the vaccine.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Center for Health Journalism. Let me just get this started. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Thumbs up, Dan? Cool. So great. My name is Umair Irfan, and I'm a staff writer at Vox. As Michelle said, I did a bit of a turn here right at the beginning of the pandemic, switching from climate to covering this, global catastrophe. And that's, I guess, enough about me, but I think I'll tell you a little bit about Vox and how we approach these kinds of stories. We're a digital news outlet, and we have platforms ranging from our website to podcast, YouTube, and Netflix. And our focus is on explaining the context behind current events. So our editorial focus isn't necessarily about getting scoops or breaking stories, but about getting the big picture. And that's reflected in our coverage, particularly the explainer format. And that's kind of what I've been doing, is writing big picture explainers about the pandemic, things like how the immune system works, how a vaccine functions, and then some of the ins and outs of that. I don't proclaim any unique expertise in this area. I'm sure there are people on this call who could school me on many of these issues. This presentation is built on some of the things that I've learned over the past few months and just how I see things potentially shaking out in the future. I'll talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Dan, and then we can have a spirited Q&A from there. So just to outline the presentation, I'll just break it down into three sections. First, I'll talk a little bit about the technical aspects of a vaccine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these aspects, which is why I'll keep it brief, but I think it's worth having this context because it helps explain the next section, which is what's unique here about the COVID-19 pandemic and the race for a vaccine here, particularly aspects like how fast it's going, some of the unique technologies that we're developing, and the scale at which we will need to be vaccination campaign. And this is where I'll spend the bulk of my discussion. And then at the end, we'll talk about some of the technical challenges and also some of the emerging storylines in the coming weeks. So the basic thing to know about vaccines is that they're engineered to cause an immune response without causing a severe infection or illness. Vaccines can and do cause mild symptoms, and there are also some serious side effects that can lead to some serious complications. However, those complications are rare because vaccines are rigorously tested. Since they're administered to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, even rare complications get magnified. A 1 in a million outcome will occur 330 times in the US if we were to administer a vaccine to everybody in this country, which is why we have to work very hard to get the rate of complication lower than we would for other kinds of drugs or other kinds of pharmaceuticals. And since vaccines are administered to people that are healthy, there's a less of a tolerance for side effects, and they're also given to people that have pre-existing conditions. So we have to work around those complications as well. Another thing to remember about vaccines is that they face well, in addition to the higher bar for immunity, they use a lot of different tactics to generate immunity. There's a lot of different approaches. Right now, we have about 200 vaccine candidates under investigation all around the world. We've got about 9 in phase 3 clinical trials. Some of them have some overlapping techniques, but they're using a smorgasbord of just different techniques and tactics to try to generate immunity to this. And then finally, one thing to remember is that a vaccine is not just something we take as individuals. It is something that benefits us all the more people take it. I benefit when I get vaccinated, but I also benefit when you get vaccinated. And somebody who isn't vaccinated gets a benefit when everyone around them is vaccinated. And this is the idea behind herd immunity. There are going to be some people that are fundamentally unvaccinatable because they have some kinds of immunological conditions, or we may not be able to reach them with a vaccine. They benefit from protection when everyone around them is protected. And that's a big part of the public health strategy for how we distribute vaccines. And that's kind of what sets them apart from other drugs. So this illustration here is a very pared down schematic of how the immune system generates a response in white blood cells. This isn't going to be on the test, but if there's one thing to know about the immune system, it's this. The immune system is very complicated. T cells are not the whole story. Antibodies are not the whole story. Antibodies plus T cells are not the whole story. The whole story is a very complicated, boring novel with too many characters. But it's important to remember that there's a lot of different factors that constitute immunity. The B cell response, the T cell response, the antibody titers together, those factors, when they render immunity, are known as the correlate of immunity or the correlate of protection. Right now, we don't know what the correlate of protection is for COVID-19. What that means is we can't simply inject somebody with a vaccine and look at their biomarkers and determine whether or not they are immune. That's why we have to put this through the paces of clinical trials. We have to actually test this vaccine in the real world against the actual virus to make sure it offers protection. This is a time-consuming and very expensive process. For most vaccines, this is a big reason why vaccine development efforts take decades. Now, as I said earlier, vaccines use a variety of different approaches. In the diagram on the right, you can see sort of the conventional tactics for developing vaccines and some of the vaccines that use them. The things like the live attenuated vaccine, which is basically a weakened form version of the pathogen, or the inactivated vaccine, which is a dead version, a subunit, which is just a portion of it, and a toxoid, which is the toxic waste or the toxic byproduct of a pathogen. In general, the more closely a vaccine can imitate its target, the stronger and longer lasting the immune response, but not always. There's always different viruses just have different functions physiologically, and those are difficult to account for. And another thing to remember is that the immune system can also overreact. With COVID-19, some of the most serious complications we see are not caused by the virus itself, but by the immune response, by the immune system going into overdrive and causing a lot of collateral damage. So with a vaccination effort, we want to coach the immune system to be able to combat the virus should it appear, but also not so much that it does more harm than good. It's a very fine balancing act. So a big part of what's unique here is the pace of progress. Why? For one thing, researchers around the world are cooperating with one another at unheard of levels. Scientists are a bit competitive and they're territorial, yet researchers from around the world are teaming up. Private companies, public universities, they're all sharing notes, and that has definitely accelerated the development process. Another key factor here is how many resources are being poured into this endeavor. Vaccines typically take a long time to develop, which means they make a very poor investment for private companies. A lot of vaccine research on previous drugs has stalled, including past coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, because there just wasn't a good enough market for it, or those disease outbreaks faded away before a vaccine could be completed. But now governments, philanthropists like Bill Gates and businesses are pouring billions of dollars into this endeavor. There are also groups like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, that was born out of the vaccine development effort for the Ebola virus. And that effort was stalled repeatedly because the outbreaks of the Ebola virus were sporadic and they were occurring in poor countries. And so a bunch of researchers and philanthropists got together and said that they wanted to have a mechanism for continuously funding vaccine research, even if it shifts off of the public health radar. And there are now several governments and initiatives that are paying for vaccine development, even building supply chains and manufacturing capabilities for vaccines prior to them gaining approval. That means that while we're testing them, we're also building factories for making them with the expectation that some of those vaccine candidates will not come to fruition. And another thing to talk about, again, is to emphasize on the pace side, within 2 months of getting the genome sequenced of the COVID-19 virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a company, Moderna, which we'll talk about in a moment, injected the first human with its vaccine candidate. That's absolutely bonkers fast to go from not knowing anything about a virus in 2 months to having an actual vaccine possibility is crazy. And that's in part because of the new technologies that we're bringing to bear on this. And the another factor is that we're overlapping clinical trials. The phase 1 and phase 2 in particular, we're running those concurrently, and that is helping us speed up the development process. However, we've just talked about COVID-19, the vaccine development effort as a race. Some scientists bristle at that. Clearly there's a time element at work, and really there's a clear urgency when thousands of people are dying and millions are infected and lots of people are out of work. But the key benchmarks here are safety and efficacy. Those are established in early phases of clinical trials, but they have to be reestablished on larger and larger swaths of the population, and including people with, immunological compromised systems, and also people with underlying health conditions and so on. And also the first vaccine to get FDA approval will have to clear a minimum efficacy benchmark. But beyond that, there's very likely to be a continued jostling among the vaccine candidates for effectiveness. The first vaccine candidate we get that gets approval may not be the best one. It may not be the ideal one. Very likely we will also need more than one type of vaccine for different groups of people, for different immune conditions, as we mentioned. And also, finally, a vaccine is not a magic end the pandemic button. Just having a vaccine doesn't let us get back to normal. We have to look at the correlate of protection. We have to look at how long immunity lasts. Ideally, we're aiming for high efficacy and long-term protection. But short of that, we may end up in a situation where we have to revaccinate people or give boosters in order to effectively contain the pandemic. And in the meantime, we're still going to be needing measures like social distancing, like wearing masks. Those are critical to how we deploy vaccines because they keep transmission low, which allows vaccine distribution to be more and more effective. And that's also why some scientists really hate the term Operation Warp Speed. They think it adds an unnecessary element of speed that can actually be counterproductive. This animation comes from the New York Times and from a fantastic article that kind of highlights just what I was describing in the last slide. So the bars in the initial phase you see is basically how clinical trials of vaccines and development effort work. You can see that each stage is actually sequential. Like we have to finish pre-laboratory testing, then go to phase 1, then go to phase 2, then go to phase 3, et cetera. But what we're doing with COVID-19 is that we're, again, not only shrinking the amount of time we spend in each phase, but we're overlapping them. And crucially, if you look near the bottom, the manufacturing is already taking place. We're already building factories for manufacturing vaccines, even though none have gotten full approval. So one of the other key factors here that makes this the hunt for a COVID-19 vaccine so unique is the fact that we've got new technologies. Recall what I said earlier about conventional vaccines. Those involve using structures of the virus. And that's the approach that we've been using for pretty much centuries, since the Edward Jenner vaccine for smallpox. But now we're looking at ways not just of imitating the structure of a vaccine, but imitating how it functions. Different people have different category definitions, but the way I divide this is that the prior generation of vaccines, I consider those to be structural vaccines. And this new generation of vaccines, I call them genetic vaccines. These are the approaches being used by companies like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Oxford. And these are probably some of the biggest revolution in vaccines in more than a century. So this diagram highlights the approach by Moderna. This is a company that's already in phase 3 trials. I'll use this as a case study, but understand that not every genetic vaccine works the same way. There are some important differences between them, but I'm just using this as just sort of an example. Moderna has an mRNA vaccine, and in this diagram, I mean, it looks complicated, but we'll just focus on this part here. So what they do is that instead of starting with the structure of the virus, these genetic viruses use instructions for making the viruses. And these instructions can be coded in DNA or a related molecule called RNA. And Moderna is using mRNA. And compared to DNA, RNA is a very short-lived molecule. It's broken down very quickly in the body. But Moderna claims that they developed their vaccine without ever having to handle the live SARS-CoV-2 virus. And they said a sample of that virus never entered any of their facilities. Instead, what they did was they used the genome of the virus that was posted online by Chinese researchers back in January. And then within 2 months, they were able to sequence that genome and use the portion of the genome that they were interested in and start building their vaccine around that. So one key advantage of this approach is that it's very modular and that it's very fast. In Moderna's case, they use mRNA. And the mRNA segment here codes for the spike protein of the virus. The spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is what it uses to dock with cells. It engages with the surface proteins of a human cell. It enters the cell, and then it begins replicating, making copies of itself before bursting out. So that's the viral replication life cycle. The logic here, though, is that by creating the spike protein inside the human body, the immune system can recognize that as a foreign invader and start building its immune response around it, particularly making antibodies. And these are proteins that can attach to the spike protein and prevent it from docking. And the idea is that once you have you teach your body how to make these antibodies, if the virus does infect you, it can effectively produce these antibodies and prevent the docking from taking place. The problem is that the human body tends to treat free-floating RNA and DNA as hostile. The body just generally doesn't like it when things are in places where they shouldn't be. RNA is only found in the cell's cytoplasm and in the cell's nucleus. DNA is only found in cells in the nuclei of cells. And so the body starts seeing strands of genetic material floating around outside. It can actually trigger an inflammatory response. And also there's a ton of enzymes in the body that break down RNA very readily. You actually have RNA digesting enzymes on your skin. And so to get RNA into a cell, what Moderna is doing is effectively they're encasing the RNA in what amounts to an oil bubble. These are phospholipids. And it's basically the same stuff that the cell membrane is made out of. And so they inject these, they put the mRNA inside the bubble, and then they put the bubbles, they inject that into the muscle, and then those bubbles fuse with the cell, inject the RNA into the cell's cytoplasm, and then there the cell will read the instructions of the RNA and start manufacturing the spike protein. And then once the spike protein is made, the cell will either embed it on its surface or will secrete it outside into the luminal space. Either way, the immune system can then start to building an immune response. And so by using this process, the vaccine doesn't just imitate the structure of the virus, it's imitating the function. And the logic is that this could potentially lead to a more robust immune response than a conventional structural vaccine. Finally, one thing that sets apart the vaccine effort for COVID-19 compared to others is that we're dealing with a pandemic, not just an outbreak. We're talking about a generalized risk where vast majority of people around the world remain vulnerable to it. The virus is already spread around the world, and we need a global effort to contain it, which means we need to get just about everyone in the world. That means we need scale. Remember what I said earlier about how vaccines protect individuals and they protect populations. This is a key reason why we need to start thinking on the order of billions with a COVID-19 vaccine, and why the infrastructure and logistics are so important. Think about how we administer other vaccines, things like for childhood illnesses like like measles, we tend to immunize children and babies because they're the fresh incoming people, but that's a much smaller subset of the population than every adult and every child. And so that's why COVID-19 is going to be orders of magnitude much more complicated because we're doing something on such a massive scale. And so, yeah. And just imagine making 7 billion of anything, let alone something as complicated as a vaccine. And I think you pretty much get the idea of why this is going to be so enormously difficult. And so then that leads into what are some of the potential emerging storylines and some of the things to pay attention to in the coming weeks. One thing to remember is just that there's no guarantee that any vaccine will ever clear clinical trials. We're very optimistic. What scientists have seen so far has been very promising, but again, no guarantee. There's dozens of viruses that we've been trying to vaccinate against for decades and still haven't succeeded. And I haven't seen much on reporting on how we would cope with such a scenario, and I think that's worth investigating a little bit further. And I touched on this earlier, but yes, how well we do in terms of containing transmission now yields dividends for how well a vaccination effort will work. The fewer cases we have when a vaccine is available, the fewer amount of vaccinations we will need to start containing the pandemic. And conversely, if there is a rampant outbreak that's uncontrolled, we could very easily shoot past whatever the threshold is for herd immunity. Herd immunity is not a magic stop pandemic threshold. I mean, we could easily get up to 70 to 80% infected if we don't do a good job of containing the spread of the virus. And then finally, the scale of the endeavor will bring its own challenges, namely how we build and distribute, administer, and pay for vaccines on a global scale. There may be shortages of vials, syringes, and freezers. Remember all the shortfalls with PPE and testing so far. And then remember that, with these new technologies, with these RNA vaccines and the DNA vaccines, these are things we've never done at scale before. We have technologies for building, structural vaccines all around the world, but we're building these genetic vaccine facilities for the very first time. And we're still learning how to do that. And similarly, many of these vaccines also they have very narrow tolerances, so they require things like minus 80 degrees Celsius freezers. UPS, the shipping companies, actually is now installing these freezers in a couple of their hubs. And other, vaccine efforts require things like, inducing an electrical current across skin to help permeate the vaccine. But looking from the bottom up, it seems like there's a big gap in terms of how local governments and how local health facilities will respond to this. These are going to be the front lines of the vaccine distribution effort. And I think there needs to be a lot more reporting and a lot more just research being done on how they're going to come up with the resources to actually do this, given how many constraints they already face and the budget shortfalls they're facing. So these are the things to watch in the coming weeks and months. Plenty of other angles here, but I'll conclude my presentation here and I'll turn it over to Dan. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Umair. Now she's going to tell us where the rubber hits the road with this.
Hi, folks. Hopefully you're seeing my screen. Let me know if you're not. This is a culmination of a lot of things I've been covering a long time. I'm going to start by looking back at the 2009 H1N1 vaccine rollout, which has a few similarities, although the virus is obviously very different. And I've been asked to sort of talk about places where state or city type reporting might fit into it. So that's sort of the angle I'm going at here. To start with, in 2009, we had a flu that was very scary. The original reports were like, this is really bad. This is a 90% mortality rate disease that's spreading from Mexico into the US right away. There was a lot of alarm. And some of the things that happened are very familiar, should be very familiar. There was a national emergency declared. There was a test rolled out from CDC. This one worked. That was a difference. There was emergency authorization for antivirals. They worked pretty well, and they're still on the market, some of them. There was a vaccine push that immediately started April through June of 2009, and it got a lot of money, and for that time, it was billions of dollars. Now it's trillions, and it was a simpler time. And even though the overall coordination and people acting were less contaminated by the politics we have now, there still was, the vaccine rollout was not a great one. It came out that basically 40% of people ended up getting the flu vaccine that year, and only 20% ended up getting the H1N1 vaccine when it finally did roll out. There were initially shortages that angered people who wanted it very badly in the fall, and then there were surpluses when it was realized that this flu virus wasn't that as dangerous as initially thought. So you're going to see that kind of hump, I think, or an echo of it in the vaccine rollout whenever it comes. Even today, there's back and forth from federal officials on when it's going to happen. Let's see. But the main thing here is that the big lesson is that public opinion is everything. You can have a beautiful vaccine. It can be, perfect. You can roll it out great. It can be sitting on the shelves at the sports center or the doctor's office. And if the public doesn't trust that it's going to work, or they're worried about side effects, they aren't going to get it. It's voluntary to get this vaccine. So public motivation is the key thing here. So all of the discussions that we're hearing, back and forth about logistics and refrigeration and, data safety monitoring boards, like it should all be refracted to this window of like, how does this affect public trust in the vaccine? Because that, it turns out, is going to be the major player in all this. And, it's been sinking for this summer when we're seeing things go on. This slide's a little busy, I apologize, but, there's some points in there that show places where there's room for metro reporting or state reporting. You should be asking your state health agency, your city health agency, if they're ready for this kind of rollout. I mean, it's an obvious thing to do. You should be gauging local opinion. You should be bracing for people to be disappointed. And you should be also braced for the initial results, as Umair said, to not be great from the first vaccine. The polio vaccine, the first one that came out, people really wanted it badly. A lot of people got it, and it wasn't perfect. There was a rebound in the late 50s in terms of polio cases that weren't fixed until a better vaccine came out in the early 60s. So we could see things like that very easily here. And, part of your job is going to be, letting people and your producers and your editors know that ahead of time. This is a CDC figure. This is from their August meeting, and it's predicting shortages. If you see the red circle in there, there are going to be what are perceived as shortages. Not everybody's going to be able to get a vaccine as soon as it comes out. Today, the CDC Director Redfield said there might be numbers of vaccines in the November-December timeframe, but he's not expecting people to get widely vaccinated until the third quarter of next year, maybe late second quarter. So that red circle is a lot longer than that CDC graphic shows. And in 2009, there were people really mad about the shortages, and they were mad when people they didn't think should get it got it. And there were times when people who shouldn't have got it. And, we're not immune to that kind of thing now, especially because CDC is trying to give people flexibility, state agencies flexibility in who gets it. And so you're going to see a lot of tension, because when there's shortages and people dying, people get angry, as you probably know from the phone calls and tweets and emails you've been getting about all this. One thing I should say, having covered H1N1, is you should expect people to sending you a lot of why didn't you tell me emails and why didn't you tell me tweets and that sort of thing. We are the messengers, and shooting the messenger is sort of a American pastime. So don't expect people to have read what you wrote a week ago in all this when you say, yeah, I told you about it. They're going to be a shortfall. Anyways, this matters because there'll be a patchwork. In 2009, 20% rather of kids in Georgia got the H1N1 vaccine, and 80% of them did in Rhode Island. It's going to vary all over the country. So it's not a national story. It's going to become a local story. A big question hanging right now is like, who gets the vaccine first? Again, this is from that CDC vaccine meeting. And it shows the overlay of different groups they're talking about, along with the National Academy of Sciences, who might get the vaccine first. They're only talking about 3 to 5 million doses being ready October 31st, maybe 35, 40 million ready December. And a key thing I think Umair mentioned is that these are double dose vaccines we're talking about, these first cities. So like every time you see a number like we have 100 million doses, we have 35 million doses, whatever, cut that number in half, because these are, you have to get 2 shots, and they're 28 to 21 days apart, which really complicates logistics. Just getting people to volunteer to get 1 shot is hard enough, but getting them to volunteer to come back at the right time to get the second shot really complicates things. So you're going to have complicated logistics, prioritization of who gets it, and they haven't quite settled on who that is. It seems to be leaning towards healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are both worried about, they want it to be a safe vaccine, but they're also worried about the perception that they're getting to the head of the line. And people in nursing homes, essential workers, and people with vulnerabilities to that. We've seen in this pandemic, there's some populations more vulnerable than others. So that's a fight that's going to play out over the next month, like who is at the center of these circles here that I'm showing you. Why does all this matter, right? As Umair talked about, we need a certain part of the population to get vaccinated or have had the disease for this so-called herd immunity to take place, which is the big way to stop transmission of the illness throughout the population. And it's not perfect, and depending on how we do it, the illness can start spreading, regardless of the number. And it might be locally, it might be one place, another place it might be different. You have to be careful. This number might be really lower. If we could figure out how to vaccinate super spreaders, or maybe if we handed out a vaccination every time you walk into a bar at a university, maybe the herd immunity number is much lower, or herd mentality, as the president called it yesterday, which probably doesn't help give people confidence in the whole thing. On top of that, this slide is about, there's a serious political divide in the country right now about willingness to get the vaccine. That's not great, right? If we're trying to get this 50% number, and if only 41% of people in certain parts of the country are willing to get the vaccine, then you don't get to that number. It's just that simple. So things that exacerbate political divides on this issue are things you should be paying attention to. There's stories there, right? If you have different candidates saying different things, that's going to cause problems. And then there's what's a huge issue here, and the National Academy of Sciences is trying to address as well, CDC, is the racial divide in willingness to get vaccinations. How do you do this? Again, it's a voluntary thing, getting a vaccine. And if you have populations that don't trust medicine, for good reasons for many decades, how do you say to them, trust me, this time is different? This is a hard one to just, fix with a promise and a smile. You really have to show a commitment in these communities and get their own leadership involved in being willing to take the vaccine. It's going to be an issue that you should pay close attention to. Different communities where you're reporting from are going to be having different responses to this. On top of all this, there's an election, it turns out. We have less than 50 days to an election. And there are a lot of players here that you should be paying attention to. This chart is sort of like from one side of the push and pull over a vaccine to the other. At the top you have the Trump administration, where the president clearly sees getting a vaccine out ahead of election day as a key thing in terms of pulling off a re-election. It's something that he's spoken about and that people around him have spoken about to reporters. So there's a lot of pressure on the agencies that he runs to say this is going to happen, try and make this happen, and the concern is they're going to try and bulldoze through these agencies to get at this ahead of what the people at the bottom of the list here, the academic scientists and the federal scientists who sit on these advisory boards, would really feel is the safest thing to do. You have to think of the timing here. These are 2-dose vaccines, right? So that's 28 days. So like they say, okay, we filled the Moderna or we filled the Pfizer rolls, 30,000 people. That's great, but you got to wait another 21 days, 28 days till they get their second shot. Okay, then you got to wait another 14 days till they reach what is thought to be the correlate immunity that we don't even know. And then people don't immediately get sick to test the thing. It takes 10 to 7 days to get a serious critical illness with coronavirus, which is the end marker for this. So in best case, you're talking late October. Which is why there's a lot of skepticism about having good proof of effective vaccines, in the short time frame ahead of the election. Nevertheless, you have all these players involved who are putting out things like today's playbook on how this is going to come out. My last slide is links to that. If you haven't seen it, HHS has put out a news release. You should look it over and see if there's local angles for you to pursue with its sort of scenarios. I think Appendix B in it is the place to look. In the playbook is that's where you go to your health official and say, how does this work with us here in Pittsburgh or wherever you're at. In the meantime, these guys, these different agencies that are in the middle in between Trump and the pharmaceutical companies, the advisory committees, are the folks who are mediating the shape of the logistics, the question about prioritization, and the proof. The FDA and the CDC in particular are going to be evaluating the numbers that come out of these trials, and the advisory committees are going to be weighing in on whether they're good or not. And you might say, who cares? Because Trump could just run through these advisory committees. And that's true, he could, but he can't do that without destroying public trust in the vaccines. So if you have the FDA committee come out and say this vaccine's no good, and Stephen Hahn says, I don't care, I'm issuing an EUA, that's going to be a disaster. And that's going to be a story you need to pay attention to because people are going to respond to that. It's worth mentioning the last person on the group on this slide is the pharmaceutical companies. Their position is really interesting. They're not very good at transparency, which is causing everybody a lot of schmelkes, understandably right now. They're worth following up, but they're in a tough spot. Like if they put out a vaccine that harms people, then they're on the hook. There is a 1986 law that exempts them from a lot of the sort of lawsuits that they would normally get in the vaccine case, but nobody wants to be Cutter Pharmaceutical, who were the people who caused a bunch of kids paralysis back in 1955 when they screwed up a vaccine. Like that was a disaster that, vaccine scientists still today like shudder over. So this is a really fraught situation with a lot of different players and a lot of people have their hand in the pie as the decision comes. And so what? So the November 3rd you see is coming up, but there's some important dates in between now and then. These might not be things that you report about directly, but these are going to be the spine or the bones of the response. So in just about a week, the CDC is going to have its vaccine meeting where there might be a vote on the prioritization, like who gets it? Is it health workers? Is it people in nursing homes? That sort of thing. That will have a big impact on the shape of the prioritization question. HHS's vaccine committee is having a meeting right after that. These are public meetings, obviously. Well, not obviously. Some of the meetings, Operation Warp Speed, not public. But these are public, and these will be a meeting where they overlook both the logistics and the shape of the vaccines as sort of a big picture step back from the CDC meeting about prioritization. There'll probably be another CDC meeting at the end of October. They seem to be having them monthly now. They announced the next one at the monthly meeting just to keep us on our toes. The big kahuna is FDA's October 22nd vaccine group meeting, this is the group that looks at the safety of vaccines. And the suspicion is, the thinking is, in fact, it says it on the agenda, they're going to be looking at the candidate vaccines. And so this is the point at which we might get some good numbers, interesting numbers, newsworthy numbers on how well these guys are doing, or we might not. This is the point at where it's suspected the company comes, or Operation Warp Speed comes to the FDA and says, give us emergency use authorization. And then Stephen Hahn has promised, the FDA head has promised that this committee would get a chance to weigh in. And members of this committee are very skeptical of rushing one of these things through, and they don't care about who gets reelected or who doesn't get reelected. They just want this vaccine to be safe because they see an anti-vaccination movement growing in this country, and they don't want anything to spur that. So that happens October 22nd. This is the time frame the optimists in the administration have talked about, like data coming out from these trials. And then November 3rd is election day. There's going to be a lot going on in between those two dates. A lot of noise. So that's going to be the crucial thing. And the result from election day could further undermine public trust, which again is the key thing here, right? If we have Republicans deciding they don't like the result of the election and, the hell with Tony Fauci's vaccine because of it, again, that could be bad. So something to watch. I really got to apologize to Umair. He did a nice scientific job, and here I'm giving you sort of the gut level political editor's response. But that's the world we live in now. It's not a chemistry lab. By December 31st, the CDC has projected there would be about 35 to 45 million doses available from the first two Operation Warp Speed candidates. Remember, cut that number in half. Right? There's 320 million people in this country, right? 20 million doses is not 320 million. It's not 50% of 320 million. By July 1st, Operation Warp Speed is promising us 300 million doses. Bear in mind today's release of the guidebook that HHS put out. They're babbling about 660 million doses by that time frame. So, whether or not any of those things are happening, we're going to keep close eye on it. And I put in a little caveat here, which probably should go for all my slides. Bear in mind that nobody knows anything about this virus. Could be completely wrong here. Something new could come out. The news that the virus lingers in the air for 16 hours at CDC dropped on us yesterday could be a big factor, could not be a big factor. Who knows? Things like that are going to be coming along with like adverse events being reported at random from these trials and from the first rollout of the vaccine that will throw people for a tizzy for a while, that we'll all be reporting. Just to finish the thing, just this morning I added, here's the playbook today. Maybe I'll leave this here, or you can look it up. The HHS had a news release. Here's the links for their playbook from CDC and HHS's sort of overview of how they're looking at things. They're worth looking at for picking out like, where is the local story for you? Just think like, who can I ask at my medical center? Who can I ask in my health agency? Like, what do they think of this? Is this crazy, or is this good, or are we ready for this? Are we not? There's just a gazillion stories that we're all going to be doing, and that there are opportunities here. And I think I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm going to post those two links in the chat for everybody in a moment. But we have a number of questions already, and I just want to tell everybody that you can post your questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom app, and we will be taking them. So one of the first questions we have here is from Robert Isman, who says, are the vaccines that are currently being tested among sufficient numbers of elderly children and others at high risk, such as those individuals should feel comfortable getting them, or would they even be approved for those populations if not tested among them in sufficient numbers?
I can take a crack at that. So one of the key factors here is that with the phase 3 trials, you are trying to get a larger segment of the population. In phase 1 and phase 2, you're typically testing them in otherwise healthy people with no pre-existing conditions. And in phase 3, we're talking about 30,000 people per trial pool. So you are trying to incorporate people that better reflect the population at large, but within reason. There are certain kinds of pre-existing conditions they have to exclude for safety reasons, and others that you exclude for just the fact that it would maybe not give you good data with the data pool. And there are also some risk issues as well. But what that means is then that after phase 3, we have a better sense of what the safety profile is across the population. Now, like I said at the end, is like we're not going to necessarily have one vaccine that's going to be good for everyone. We're very likely, after running all of these tests, find out that there are actually some vaccines that are better optimized for some groups than they are for others. And that's really what's going to shake out. And that's why, we have to keep up the pressure on developing a vaccine, because we don't quite know exactly how the vaccines that are going to shake out. And we are going to probably need every tool in the chest that we have in order to make sure that we account for the more vulnerable groups. In terms of testing, making sure that they're accounted for, that's why we have, these advisory boards, and there are supervisory committees at the FDA that are also staffed by non-agency scientists, people that are looking at the outside who are screening and making sure that the pools actually do meaningfully reflect the wider population, that they are as diverse as possible. But it's sort of a balancing act. Like, you want to make sure that they reflect the population, but you also want to make sure that they're, that everybody being tested has a reasonable degree of safety, that we're not going to inflict harm on somebody in our pool by mistake. So it is a balancing act, but yes, there is a concerted effort to try to make sure that we can get it to everybody, because that is part of our vaccination strategy. We want to get as many people vaccinated as possible.
Great, and we have a question from Ashley Tabasco, who says, media plays a role in polarization and, quote, balances bias, perpetuates misconceptions and perceptions about scientific successes or understanding, such as the scientific consensus on climate change. What role and responsibility does the media have? And further, what should the media be doing to support trust building? Some things that come to mind are increasing reporting now on the safety and efficacy of existing vaccines, emphasizing the global collaborative efforts, emphasizing scientists and companies' commitment to safety and efficacy, and rejection of political pressure.
So this is a fraught question. The journalism is a free country, and everyone can do it differently. That's one of the things that makes the US the way it is. So I personally don't think it's my job to propagandize for the government or anybody. My job is to report accurately what's going on. If the vaccine looks safe and enough outside experts say it looks safe, then I report that. If they don't, then I don't. It's not my job to build public trust. It's the job of the government. They're the institution that is, and medical experts. It's their job to build trust in this. It's the job of the pharmaceutical company to produce a vaccine that's sufficiently safe, that it's clear that we can report people that it's safe. It becomes very dangerous when you turn us into tasks. Both of us, Umar and I, have reported on climate change for a long time. I've been doing it since 1995. And this whole balance of bias thing is a really bad idea that Max Boykoff foisted on us in 2004. It's my opinion. And so, like, I'm not going to tell people that this is a great, safe vaccine if it's not. I mean, we put in our stories context that, like, most vaccines are very safe. I mean, this is something that anybody responsible as a journalist does. But the idea that we're going to be cheerleaders for a vaccine that we don't know is safe yet is a dangerous one, and it's a role that I'm unwilling to play. I'm sure Omer might have different views, or might have the same view.
No, I agree with that, and I'll just pick up on one other point. Journalists tend to get a little siloed. Like the science journalists, I think, and the science journalism around these vaccines has been actually, I think, quite good. And I mean, Vox, the way we cover things, like I said, we don't break news. We draw on other people's reporting quite a bit. And I have to give a shout out to the wonderful folks at BuzzFeed and other news outlets that have done excellent coverage of this, that has, augmented our own reporting. The science reporting isn't really the issue. It's just that when it starts entering other aspects of coverage like politics and business, that's where it starts to get a little confused. If you Google the name of any of these pharmaceutical companies, right, that are developing vaccines, the first thing that'll come up is probably a link to the latest on their vaccine trial. The second link is going to be something about their stock price linked to that vaccine trial. And there's been a lot of publication by press release that's been going on that I think has been, frankly, a little disappointing by some of the business press that have been picking up on using results that companies are putting up because they want to hype their own brand, even though they haven't published the evidence behind it. Moderna has been guilty of this. There's another company called Gilead, which is developing, remdesivir, which is one of the antiviral drugs. They've also been, announcing some of their results by press release. And even Oxford University, they were criticized last month because they published some of their results in a press release for reasons that a lot of scientists were scratching their heads about because, they're a university and not a private company. But basically, the hype cycle, I think science journals tend to do a pretty good job about this, but like business journalists, who are trying to track, individual movements of the stock market, will take a small result and blow it up. And really, I think there needs to be more newsroom-wide collaboration. Like, I think that if you are going to do something that touches on science, it helps to touch base with your local resident science reporter to make sure, is this something worth hyping or providing a little bit of appropriate context. And I think that's really the way you get around. You start building trust, essentially, that you don't have one end of the newsroom hyping something and the other end of the newsroom, trying to tamp it down. Like you should be on message throughout all your coverage.
And Umair, this is a really interesting point you're making. And I just want to clarify for those in our audience who aren't regularly covering, science or medical studies, would it be correct to say that in a more typical scenario, a researcher who's either in a pharmaceutical company or in a university doing research with them would publish in a peer-reviewed journal, the time cycle would be much longer, and there would be a level of scrutiny in the medical and research community that's being circumvented by these press releases? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, because when you publish a press release, you're the gatekeeper for all the information there. You don't publish the raw data. I have never seen a press release with a spreadsheet of raw data, right? They don't do that. It's they put their bullet numbers and then a few pull quotes from their researchers, and that's it. And then, if you have Oxford University's imprimatur on it, that then suddenly gets plastered all over all the mainstream news outlets. Now, that said, I mean, the conventional method you noticed is, yes, this peer review process where you put your results up, you go through peer review, and then a few months later you publish it. Part of what's different about COVID-19 is we've seen an acceleration of that as well, particularly with the rise of preprint publications. I think that's actually useful and is actually done well, because what these scientists are doing is actually they're publishing their data before going through peer review, and you sort of see this peer review in real time. You see the results right away. You see some early results. They may not necessarily, some of the conclusions may not hold up, but it helps accelerate the process because, one, there's a lot more transparency about what they're doing and what you're finding. There's a lot more public scrutiny. And that's one way of accelerating the process of that can be pretty stodgy when it comes to peer review. But again, the transparency, there's a lot more transparency when you publish on a preprint server than when you just put out a press release. And that's kind of why, like when I report on a story, one of the first things I always do is I talk to the researchers. I ask, can you give me a copy of your paper or just some draft results? Because I want to look at the numbers too, to just verify that everything adds up the way you tell me they add up. And I think that's just one of the basic box checking exercises that a reporter should be doing.
Just bear in mind, we're watching like 20 years of research being compressed into 6 months. And so it's the equivalent of covering a car crash, right? This is a breaking news event. So like the first reports from the preprint ain't necessarily going to be right. Like this isn't how it is normally. You should approach it with the same caution you hear when there's been a shooting somewhere, like the first time you hear about a preprint. Like this is really messy compared to the normal process.
And so Umair and Dan, I'm guessing that for those who don't have, say, a science journalism background, you would advise that they maybe try and enlist a local expert who can just help them decipher these studies so that they're not these preprint, right?
If you can find
if you can't do
the local medical university, you're doing great. Yeah, find that person and tell them you're going to be a pain in the ass, and like tell them that this is how it's going to be, but that you need it for responsible reporting.
Great.
Yeah, do your own peer review.
Yeah, that's what we do anyways, basically.
And we have a question from Sally James, who says, I've had trouble getting local vaccine research officials, including the overall administrator, Fred Hutch, to provide any details on the outreach they're doing, any advice.
Yeah, see if you can report that they aren't doing that. Like that's the way to start hammering on them. Like they're not telling us anything. Is that, and there should be people really pissed off about that. And then the only way that these guys learn to play nice with us, generally speaking, is like you beat them up a little bit. And then they like suddenly they want to be friends with you. So that's how I did it back in the day. That's the only thing that works. They're busy. You have to hammer on them to get their attention. And that's our job as reporters.
We have a question from David Shapiro. Oh, great. From David Shapiro, vaccines stimulate immune response. That's their traditional role, and it doesn't seem to have changed with this plague. Yet a major interpretation of its deadliness is that it's a result of over-response, cytokine storm. Is this going to be a serious risk with the vaccines? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned this briefly in my talk, but like you do want to modulate the immune response, right? You want to make sure that it's when you inject somebody with a vaccine that the immune system gets enough of a workout that it can deal with the actual virus, but not so much that it overreacts. And you may have seen in the past couple of weeks, the Oxford AstraZeneca trial in the UK was put on hold because they had an adverse outcome in one of their phase 3 trials. And that was precisely an immune system overreaction in one of their patients, right? Like they detected it, which was good. And they put the trial to a stop, which was also good. I mean, I think, yeah, the fact that they had to stop a trial is bad, but the system worked as intended. And I think I take that as a good sign. Their vaccine product is a little bit different. So it is also a genetic vaccine, but what they're using is actually an adenovirus as a vector. So they're using a different virus that's been modified to not reproduce, but to introduce the part of the genome of the coronavirus into the cell. And so that's a little bit more tricky because because the adenovirus is a virus that can infect humans on its own. And so you want to make sure that the human body doesn't react to the vector. And then also because you are imitating the function of a virus with these genetic vaccines, on one hand, it can generate a stronger immune response. On the other hand, that immune response could be too strong. And that's something that we're still trying to figure out. The questioner brought up the cytokine storm. That's particularly true in the elderly where you have less strict control of the immune system. And so in the earlier phase of the trial, we're not testing them in the elderly patients. In phase 3, we are going to get some more people over the age of 65 in these pools. And that's where we might see some of these signals. And so it is something that we have to pay attention to going forward to make sure that, yes, we are not causing the immune system to overreact.
The vaccine presumably will stop the infection that 7 to 10 days later leads to that cytokine storm or that immune system overreaction. That's the hope.
And we have a question from Centauri Chamley. What legal recourse do global citizens, including those taking part in trials, have if COVID-19 vaccines are unsafe?
So there's a very complicated system for dealing with vaccine adverse events. In the trials themselves, I think that when you sign that consent form, you have less protection, at least in the United States. I really can't speak to other countries very well. But in the United States, there is a vaccine adverse event reporting system that sort of mediates complaints about serious side effects from vaccines. And it goes through that avenue for the reason that, it could bankrupt companies trying to put out these vaccines if it turns out that it's causing serious problems. So the answer is you have less than you would if somebody sold you a car that the steering wheel didn't work. That's one of the reasons why there's a higher standard for safety and efficacy in these trials. You are giving people who are healthy something that might hurt them. I mean, that's a higher standard than people who are already sick and you're trying to help them. So yeah, it's going to be something well worth reporting, like exactly the contours of that, where it stands right now. But there is a very effective vaccine adverse event reporting system. Umair, you might know more about this, but that's sort of where things are with vaccines in the United States.
Yeah, and like each country has its own vaccine regimen, and so like you have to deal with local regulatory authorities. Like the UK AstraZeneca trial is only 10,000 people, but in the US when they're doing their trial, they're doing it with 30,000 people, and that's because of local rules. And so it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, whatever recourse you may have. If there is an adverse event, that really depends on your local government and the laws that they've set up.
And we have a question from Patrick Pine who says, I recall that every year there's some guesswork in the formulation of flu vaccines, and some years have been more effective than others. So with respect to this virus, is it likely that the vaccine formulations would need to be changed over time if the characteristics of this virus change?
I'll take that. So flu influenza is kind of unique because it's a disease that just about once a year goes through a reassortment process where basically it changes in a substantial enough way that previous immunity doesn't render protection against the current virus. And so with influenza in particular, like there's a surveillance program that tries to anticipate what strains of influenza are circulating, and then they try to generate a vaccine to those strains. And sometimes there's a mismatch between the two. Like you may have a different strain of influenza circulating than the one that you've developed a vaccine to. And so that's kind of what makes it difficult. With the SARS-CoV-2, the COVID-19 virus, it is mutating. Viruses mutate all the time. You should be skeptical of any headline that starts with, oh, this virus is mutated. This is something that happens all the time. Right now, we don't see mutations away from immunity. Like the main thing that we're focusing on are the spike proteins. We're not seeing those mutate very much. We use mutations to track different strains of the virus in different parts of the world, and that's how we trace outbreaks. But for the most part, the way the virus has been evolving, we don't really see it moving away from immunity. There was that case in South Korea where a patient was likely infected twice, but the second infection was much less, even though it was with a slightly different strain, because that immunity from the first strain was somewhat applicable to the later strain, even though they were still infected a second time. So there's going to be some overlap, there's going to be some movement, but given what we know now, and also given what we know from previous coronaviruses, immunity to those has lasted typically 2 to 3 years. And so the expectation based on what we learned from those lessons is the same thing here.
The experiment that is going on is what part of the virus is the thing keying on. A lot of the viruses are looking at the whole spike protein that he's talked about it, but some are looking at just the RBD protein, which is the tip of the spike. Some are looking at specific things on the spike. Some of these inactivated viruses are looking at whole dead virus. So that's a giant experiment that's being done on people right now in these trials, is which part of the virus is the key part for the vaccine to go on.
And we have a question from VG Sundaram, who asks, could one of you speak to the issue of trials being done on nitric oxide therapy in such hospitals as Mass General?
I'm afraid I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, neither do I, I'm sorry.
Okay, and we'll go on. Heather Whitfield says, this is a global pandemic and I'm interested in telling global stories, especially the role of the US in terms of global vaccine access. What angles do you see here?
I mean, quickly, like the one concern that I've heard over and over is this idea of just sort of this the divide between haves and have-nots. As the pandemic starts fading in Europe and the United States, it might start moving toward the developing world, and the urgency for developing and distributing a vaccine may fade in the countries that are devoting the most resources to it, while it starts to come up in other parts of the world that are only now starting to see their spikes go up. And so the thing to keep in mind is that if we're only as safe as our least safe country, this is a virus that quickly spread around the world. So we have a vested interest in combating this on all fronts in all parts of the world, and conveying that to policymakers to make sure that we are just as vested in distributing this vaccine to other countries as we are to our own people. That's going to be a tough sell. I mean, there's this push for nationalism globally, politically, that we're seeing, and that's being reflected in the vaccine hunt as well. So that's going to be something to pay attention to going forward is this idea of vaccine nationalism and how much concern we have for other countries, knowing full well that this is something that could potentially harm us. Like, it is in our own interest to look out for other people. Can we convey that to our leaders?
And it's hard, we have so many questions here, but we'll close with one from Craig Miller. And then I'll just mention to Dan and Umair that if you have time, we can shoot you some of these questions and we can replies out to some of our participants. We also have a You Asked, We Answered feature on our website, and we could include some of those responses there if our audience wants to look out for that. But our final question is from Craig Miller, who says, what effect are you guys seeing of COVID-19 on the anti-vax movement? Is it moderating or energizing it?
The sense I have is that they're very active in looking at all this. There's a weird little subworld that is quite active on Twitter. So I worry that I'm like overly exposed to it. The expectation that I have is that when these numbers start coming out about like what are the low side effect rates and not, then we're going to see an explosion from these guys. But like they're actively discussing it. It just hasn't poked through the main mass of pandemic discussion in the midst of all this. Umair might have taken a better look at it than me, but like this is what I see on my tweet deck.
I mean, generally, the thing that concerns me most is just that there's a lot of people that are not anti-vaccine in general or not skeptical of vaccines, but are skeptical of this one. And particularly with the emphasis on speed. And the concern about political influence that Dan talked about at length. And so that, just trying to temper that, I think is going to be a big story. That, once we do develop a vaccine at record pace, now we have to go and say like, no, we actually did test this, this is actually something that we put our weight behind. That is something that we need to start investing in now as well. Like, not just manufacturing vaccines, we need to start a messaging campaign now to convince people that this is something that is safe and useful.
And it turns out Dan just informed us that he has a little more time. I don't know if Umair, you can stay a little bit longer. So we'll take a couple more questions. We have one from Richard Dickens, who says, with the potential for dozens of vaccines being used around the world, who monitors and compares long-term efficacy of each? And can there be a negative effect on people diagnosed with different vaccines?
I can take a stab at that. So after a vaccine is approved, that's not the end of testing and that's not the end of supervision. That's actually the start of what they call phase 4 clinical trials. So you not only have to, even after it's being distributed widely, companies are still on the hook for monitoring the population at large, because now going from 30,000 people to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, yes, that's a much larger trial pool, and you still have to kind of pay attention to these long-term factors, because yes, there are going to be complications that are only going to appear 1 in every 100,000 people, and that you won't catch in the earlier phases of clinical trials. And so the question is how rigorously the regulatory agencies will enforce that, will force the private companies to keep tabs on this. And that's what makes it extraordinarily expensive as well. Like now you're no longer tracking thousands of people, you're tracking potentially millions of people. And whether we are willing to invest the funding in order to maintain that ongoing, it's both a public and private issue. It's like, can we get the private companies to commit to this? And also, will we have, the FDA leadership at the top continuing to, pressure these private companies to keep tabs on this? That's going to be an ongoing challenge as well.
WHO is tracking supposedly all of the vaccines. It's not clear to me to what extent they're going to give us more than published details about them. I mean, that'll be a central repository, but it looks like they're just going to be waiting for publications, just like everybody else. Different countries, obviously, different levels of transparency. And, there is the concern that if a vaccine in China causes side effects, or Russia, we might not hear about it as soon as we ought to. The phase 3 trials are continuing. These are 2-year trials that we're talking about, that they track people's health. So they should be continuing to put out details as well from these first 30,000 or so people.
Thank you. We have a question from Joe Overett, who says, how will people without health insurance be going to get vaccines? What sorts of places would provide it? Would it be federally qualified health centers?
I'm afraid I didn't hear the question. You broke up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Let me try again. So Joe Overt asks, how will people without health insurance and undocumented people get vaccines? Where would they receive it? Would that be at federally qualified health centers?
That's a great question. The federal government is promising free vaccines right now. President Trump has spoken about that. There is a suspicion that they're going to try and slap a $50 service fee on top of that free vaccine at different places. It'll depend on the state health agency, the state health plan. Like you might go to your civic center and get the vaccine there after standing in line for free. It might be made available at a pharmacy, for free. It all depends on how the state decides to do it. And we have to see what shape federal support for paying for the vaccine comes out looking like. Again, a great local story.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, like my main concern is just past this prologue, like look at what happened with testing and just how like scattershot it was, the approach. Like some places were doing it for free and doing it, and other places were, gouging people. It's my fear is it's going to end up in a similar situation, but we can take steps now to prevent that, and I think it's worth investigating to make sure we're trying to stay ahead of that.
Every one of these questions that's a great story. You should dig into that more. But it's true because there's stories everywhere on this.
And we have a very basic question that I think is worth having you all weigh in on, because I suspect, this is from Elena Oliviero, who asks about some of the basic mechanisms of a trial, including Moderna's trial. And she says, after the participants are given either vaccines or placebos, they are then monitored over the next several weeks or months to see if they get infected, which I don't think, well, anyway, and if the vaccine is offering protection. In other words, for those leading trials, the participants are not deliberately being infected with COVID, correct? And then she goes on to say, but participants are people in high-risk professions and who would have a higher risk of exposure. Is that correct? So I think there's some clarifying that could be done here. So hoping you guys can help with that.
Sure, just briefly, I mean, phase 1 and phase 2 trials are looking for minimum standards of safety and efficacy, like what is the maximum safe dose, and also does this generate some kind of biological response? Like I said, we don't quite know what the correlate of protection is for COVID-19, but if we see people generating antibodies to a vaccine, that's a pretty good signal that it's doing something to the immune system. That said, in phase 1 and phase 2, you are not testing it against the actual virus. You only start doing that in phase 3. And so to do that in phase 3, you are not deliberately infecting people. You kind of have to wait and see. And as Dan mentioned, that's a function of just how prevalent the virus is in a given community. One strategy for accelerating that is, of course, to target people in your phase 3 trial who are in high risk roles, who are likely to get exposed. But even that will take time because you're looking for diagnosed infections that are confirmed. We know the vast majority of people who get infected get better on their own. There are plenty of people who may not, test positive for the virus, even if they are infected. And so we're trying to diagnose critical or clinically diagnosed positive cases. And you can only start breaking the blinds down on the trial only when you get to about 150 infections in your trial pool of 30,000 people. And that can take months. And that's something that just cannot be rushed. You're just at the mercy of time and the spread of the virus in your local community. And that's just kind of what you got to wait for.
And the cutoff here is critical cases. So you get infected, only 20%, 14% of people are a critical case. So, 100 people get infected, but that's only 20 people who actually fit the criteria for safety in this thing. That's what they're going for, is people not going to the hospital, not just infection, qua infection. So that lowers your numbers.
And here's the thing, just to pick up on that, once you break down say you've got in your trial pool 150 people and you break the blinds down and you look at how are those 150 people divided between the placebo and the treatment group. They're not necessarily, if it's 50-50, the FDA says 50-50 is good enough to get approval for a vaccine. That might not be good enough for me and you, but they said that's their threshold for approval. Now, the supervisory boards, the data safety and monitoring boards, they can still advise and say no, this is not good enough. We should wait and run this trial to completion. They can also make that judgment as well. But, you ideally, you would want something like a 70-30 split between the groups, if not something more drastic than a 90-10. split between, you want all your infections in the placebo group and none in the treatment group. Like that would be the most ideal scenario. We don't know how that's going to shake out until we hit that number where we can start looking.
Okay. Well, thank you both. And I just want to thank our participants for their excellent questions and thank our two wonderful panelists. And we're going to make this webinar available a little later today on centerforhealthjournalism.org. And we'd like to ask you to take a moment. Shortly, we'll be sending out a survey to all of you that will ask you for your feedback on this, as well as other topics that are of interest to you. Thank you again for joining us. And this webinar series, you can do it by text. It's very simple. You can see the information here. And have a wonderful day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.